Hello, everyone, and welcome to another little segment that we're going to try and maintain across the course of the season. And it's Ammar and myself trying to teach ourselves how to read Formula One telemetry. Have you ever read Formula
Yeah,
One? Yeah, have you ever read Formula One telemetry before, Ammar? Did you do before this season? Was it all just a bunch of squiggles, or were you a professor at it?
it's been my favorite pastime in the off season.
Right. Okay. So,
No,
so
I think
this is
it's
us.
fascinating. It's fascinating data, and I think in day and age when we get access to this kind of information, is really worth getting into. So I'm excited for today's class.
Indeed, but it's not a class because this is us teaching ourselves. So essentially, we learn, you learn. There you go.
There you go.
We're all about service. Um, before, before we start, I just want to say thank you to F1 Tempo. F1 Tempo
Yep.
has a telemetry website which you can find in the link below. It's really, really good. I've used it for all of the telemetry traces that we're using here. So thank you very much to them for allowing us to use their website and their telemetry traces. But let's get into it. So um, first first trace, what we're looking at here is it's just the three drivers that we wanted to compare. So we wanted to compare Russell, Hamilton, and Verstappen, and the reasons for those will become apparent in a minute. But you can see here that along the x-axis, which is the horizontal line with the time at which a lap was set, is the laps and what time they were set. Okay, so the first lap that all of them set was at 4:03 a.m. And the final lap that Verstappen set was at 5:04 a.m. Right, so you can see that along the horizontal axis, and along the vertical axis or the y-axis is the lap time. So we can see here that both Verstappen and Hamilton did a lap more than Russell did. And we know that because Russell aborted his final lap because he made a mistake in sector one. What we can also see here is that um, Lewis's final lap was his fastest lap, and
Mhm.
Max's penultimate lap was his fastest lap. But what was really interesting to me here was that Lewis's final lap that we know was done on a brand new set of soft tyres was actually slower than George's lap done on a used set
Also, yeah.
of soft tyres. And that for me comes back to the fact that I think Lewis has a bit of a problem in qualifying, and I don't know if it's just the last two races, but as David Croft kept saying in comms over the course of this race, that's three in a row that George has out-qualified Lewis, and it's now having tangible consequences in the race. So we have taken each driver's fastest lap. So I've taken Lewis's final lap, I've taken George's final lap, and I've taken Max's penultimate lap,
Mhm.
and we've put them all together. So the next slide, what we've done here is that we've just taken two drivers, right? So I've taken George Russell's lap and I've taken Max Verstappen's lap. And I'm using this slide just to demonstrate a few things about what the telemetry trace is looking at. Um, so the first thing to say is the white line is George and the dark blue line is Max. Um, and we've condensed this, so we've zoomed in and we're just looking at sector one. Okay. Um, the we have lots of different traces here, and the different traces are looking at different things. They're looking at different points of data that the car has sent back to the pits. So the top line, that strange wiggly line that starts at the top and ends sort of roughly in a similar position, is the speed trace. That is how fast each driver is going across that along the distance of the uh, sector one.
Okay.
So along the x-axis, the x-axis again is the horizontal line across the bottom. That's the distance. So zero is roughly the start-finish line, and the end of that horizontal line is just starting um, after the hairpin at the end of sector one. Yep. And the x-axis, the vertical, sorry, the y-axis, the vertical axis is the speed in kilometers per hour.
Mhm.
Below that, we've got the delta. I'm going to come back to that a bit later. But below that line, we have the throttle trace and the brake trace. So across that distance, the brake trace, the throttle trace tells us how much throttle each driver is applying. So at the top is 100%, that's full throttle. And anything below that is not full throttle. And the brake underneath that, along the y-axis there, is either they're braking or they're off the brakes. So if you're at the top of the line, you are braking, and if you're at the top of the line, you are sorry, at the bottom of the
So,
line, you are
yeah.
not braking. So top of the line, braking, bottom of the line, not braking. Clear?
Yep.
Cool. All right. So next slide. So this on this slide, what I wanted to show was what both drivers were complaining about. So in sector one, both drivers said, look, we don't have confidence. Both George and Lewis in the Mercedes said that we don't have confidence in the rear of the car. And this trace versus what Max was doing shows that very clearly. So I've circled on the speed trace the section after the second chicane. This is turn 6 to turn 10 roughly. So they're curves, but they're not braking zones. So they're either full throttle or part throttle. And what you can see in this is that in the speed trace, Max carries more speed. So you can see that his speed is higher, the blue line is higher than the white line. So he is carrying more speed through that segment. Okay. And that's borne out by the second yellow circle, which is around the throttle trace. And you can see here clearly that in the segment that I've circled, Max's throttle is down, it's pinned. He's on full throttle through that segment. Whereas George has had a big lift. So you can see the throttle trace is not full. So where Max can put full throttle down, George cannot. And that tells you that the Merc just has a little bit of floatiness that George is having to cancel out by lifting off the throttle. But when he does that, he loses time. And that time is then that time loss is carried throughout that segment. Do you see that?
Yep.
Cool. All
Yeah.
right. So that was the Merc against the Red Bull. The next slide, I've tried to compare George with Lewis, right?
Mm.
So Lewis, although he only finished a tenth and a half off of George in qualifying, and this is using their best laps, actually that probably flattered him. That probably flattered Lewis quite heavily. And I want to use what I've circled here to try and demonstrate that a little bit. So what we're looking at here is the breaking point for turn 4. So the cars have come through turn 1, they've gone left, they've gone right for turn 2, and then they've gone around the little kink for turn 3. Then they're going into the second chicane, turn 4 and 5. So this is Lewis braking and George braking for turn 4. And what you can see, subtle, but what you can see here is that Lewis, the white line in this trace, comes off the throttle earlier than George does. So you can see in that bottom yellow circle that in the throttle trace, Lewis comes off full throttle earlier than George does. The white line starts to drop before the green line does. Happy?
Mhm. Yep.
And what we can see in the brake trace below that is that actually Lewis hits the brakes later than
Later.
George does. And that tells me that there's a gap between coming off the throttle and hitting the brakes for Lewis. Whereas with George, you can see that although he
He's
comes off the throttle a bit later, um, he brakes at the same time. So he comes off the throttle and hits the brakes the same time. that suggests to me that Lewis has got a little bit of hesitation going into the corner. And then if you look at the exit of the corner, so there's a V that tells us the absolute minimum speed that the car reaches. That's when they're braking at their most before they hit the throttle again.
Mm.
And in the speed trace, George is slightly up. So it's slightly higher. The green line is slightly higher than the white line. But in the throttle trace, you can see why that happens because George just stamps on the throttle and goes from nothing to everything really quickly. It's a straight line straight up. Whereas Lewis hesitates a little bit and needs to progressively feed the throttle back in again, which tells me again that he wasn't that happy with the rear of the car. Why that is in the same car, I think we'll have to have another conversation. We can bookmark this about driving
Mm.
styles and about what Lewis needs. But he's talked about wanting more rear end of the car. He talked about it all last season, and he's talking about it all of this season as well. I don't have the rear end. George seems to be able to live with that a little bit better. Not he's not completely happy with it, but he seems to be able to live with it a bit better than Lewis can. And the next slide bears that out because in that segment between turn 6 and turn 10, where in the previous race I showed you that George had to lift off where Max did not. Both the Mercedes drivers did have to lift off, but you can see in both the speed trace and the throttle trace that George lifts off less than Lewis does. The white line, Lewis is lower in the throttle trace than George's green line. He's lifting off more than George's. And that tells me he's less comfortable with the rear end of the car than George's. So there you go. That's that's our first little look at some telemetry, and this has been fun for me because looking at these little squiggles has borne out what the drivers are telling us.
Mm.
Lewis is not happy with the rear end of his
Mm.
car,
Mm.
and he's less happy with it than George is, and that's being borne out by the fact that he's more hesitant going into a corner and he's more hesitant feeding the power back in. And
Back
when
in. Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
in the high speed transitions when the car starts to go a bit floaty, he is less comfortable with that than George is. And that to me explains why there's a gap between them in qualifying.
Brilliant. That's all I can really say. No, I think Lewis has complained about, the instability at the rear end, and this data bears it out. So there you go. That is one in many more master classes to come.